Welcome to the 5-Minute Leadership Podcast, where we are helping leaders solve their leadership shortages. Psalm 78 describes David's leadership in two parts. He had an upright heart and he had skillful hands. And we'll see that every aspect of leadership, there's always a heart issue and there's a skill issue. Today, we're going to talk about how to think like a leader, what leadership really is according to Jesus. And we also have the privilege of having my good friend, Pastor Paolo Punzalan, who is our example in chapter 1 of thinking like a leader. Paolo, welcome to the 5-Minute Leadership Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
You've served in many areas of leadership, just about everything except worship leader. Let's talk about servant leadership. What does that mean to you?
I think servant leadership is being able to hear what God has called you to do and just do whatever it takes to fulfill that call.
I first met you years ago. You had the opportunity to go to Russia to be a missionary. What was that like? What lessons did you learn? How did that help you become the leader you've become?
Well, there are several things we learned there because we wanted to serve Pastor Michael and Pia. They were good friends and we felt like we wanted to help them jumpstart the church in Russia. Whatever it took for the kingdom to advance, for the word of God to be preached, for the gospel to be proclaimed, that's what we did. I was a worship leader there because there were no other choice.
When you came back from Russia and you became our kids pastor, you were the kids pastor for all of my kids and helped with their spiritual foundations. And I can remember conversations where you were content being a kids pastor. Eventually, we sort of forced you into being a lead pastor and now a senior pastor. What was the mentality of whether it was kids pastor or lead pastor or senior pastor that you had?
I knew I was called to preach the gospel. And however that is expressed, it's up to God's sovereignty. In other words, if I'm called to preach the gospel in the kids ministry, I'll do that. If I'm called to preach the gospel as a lead pastor, I'll do that. So the title, the position, the role doesn't even matter.
A lot of people do see leadership positions as a stepping stone. They see it sort of as a gateway to something that they perceive to be more important. You seemed perfectly happy and content preaching the gospel to elementary school kids. What would you say to leaders who maybe they're not totally happy with where they are in their leadership role and they do aspire to something else? What would you say to those people in that situation?
Clarify what the call of God is first, and then talk to your leaders and see where would you be the best fit, which role, which function, and then preach the gospel wherever that would be.
Great. Paolo, I've noticed a lot of people that you had in kids' church are now full-time campus missionaries. They are writing our worship music. Some of them are lead pastors now. They're preaching the gospel. What would you say happened back in the day when you were working, when they were kids, when they were 6, 7, 8 years old? What does that have to do with what they're doing now?
I think number one would be the word implanted in the hearts of the people. When I get to talk to them, some of them I actually officiated their weddings, and they would say, I remember this illustration that actually led to this truth because this word was being preached. And that word bearing fruit years after is what really makes at least a huge difference for me and the reward.
We can see it in kids' church, how you were serving. How does serving play out now in what you're doing?
A lot of one-on-one, helping people, mentoring them in their marriage, in their family. Yes, we want them to excel in their leadership, but if it's not working at home, it's going to be really difficult outside the home. Helping them and coach them in their leading and the way they would preach the word as well.
And when we have younger leaders coming up, they're visionaries, they're skilled preachers, they have a lot of ministry passion. How do we get a servant's heart to stick?
Watching the attitude of entitlement.
How do we know when that entitlement creeps in? Because that's always knocking at the door. That's always there. As a person in a senior leadership role now, how do you guard against that?
Proverbs chapter 9 talks about he who walks with the wise will become wiser still. It is helpful to have people around us. Well, number one, my wife tells me right away. Also, the leaders around me who supervise me, the people, 360 degree. We're going through our assessments for this year, early part of this year. That's one of the questions I asked. I said, is there anything in my leadership that I need to adjust or change? Anything you see that I need to be cautious about?
Paolo, thank you for all the ways you've served all of these decades in Victory. I appreciate the servant's heart, servant's attitude you've always had. And I want to remind everybody in Philippians 2, it tells us that Jesus took on the form of a servant. There was never a leader as great as Jesus, and yet he took on the form of a servant. So no matter where you're leading, no matter what you're leading, every leader needs to take on the form of a servant. Think like a servant, act like a servant. That's biblical leadership.